to thank everyone for joining us as always. So we are doing if you caught the email ahead of time, going to do a little bit of a unique take on this week. So it's our fifth of these. We have survived 1 month. So thank you all very much for joining. And one of the things that we, mainly on account of the format here, like 30 minutes flies by, and so we haven't had time to take as many questions as we wanted, and we've got awesome questions and feedback along the way, like either like you all following up on social, emailing us, filling out the polls. And so wanted to kind of take an episode here and answer your questions. And so we're going to do that. As always, just by way of introductions, I'm Keith, joined here by Dave Farrow, our esteemed CISO.
Hey everybody, good to see a lot of familiar names in the list there. Good to have you back.
Yeah, very cool. And actually, like before we get into, I'd say like office hours proper, I did want to take a moment. We were reflecting on this last week. Like we've got 4 of these under our belt. It's new to us. We had no idea whether people would find these valuable, show up. Way more of you have showed up than we expected, and we appreciated everyone. Wanted to recognize this because the team kind of shared this with us. These are folks who have been to every single one of these so far. And so cannot tell you how much we appreciate you showing up, you participating, sharing your questions and your thoughts. I'll be dropping a note to each of you after this. So we got something special for you. We just wanted to say like a small thank you for your attendance and participation. So look for that here in the next day or so. So on the docket today, we're going to kind of break this up into 2 parts. We're going to take kind of what we're referred to as the mailbag first. So these are questions that you've asked during past sessions and or that you've sent to us via the feedback form, just telling us like what you'd like to hear more of, like topics, things like that maybe we've touched on and you wanted us to tackle like a little bit deeper. And then after that, we're going to look through the questions that you all have asked on the way in today, and we're just going to kind of rapid fire, just try to work through those. As always, really welcome, and like we can, we'll keep an eye on the chat. Really welcome your participation as we go as well with any or all of these. So without further ado, diving right in. So first mailbag topic was, and we had a number of questions related to like IOCs. So like we had some kind of general questions like, how do you recommend organizations think about them? We had some more specific questions that were like, how do you Red Canary treat these? Like, is it a you thing? Is it a customer thing? And so, so I wanted to turn this over, and like, Dave, I'll start with you, just, like ask you the question on behalf of Red Canary, right? Like what do we do with the static indicator that we find in our environment? And I'd just like to take a moment and kind of talk through that.
Yeah, so I will tell you, being the pointy-haired manager level of the organization here, the way I think of IOCs is I want my MDR provider to manage my IOCs. All right. It seems like a kind of a shameless pitch, but that was how I felt when I was a customer at a previous organization as well. And for the most part, I do depend on Red Canary Service to do the things with those IOCs. But we did invite one of our security engineers from the team here today to talk about the extra stuff that we do with IOCs where we've got organization specific stuff. And Nick Weber's here. He's actually built out this functionality at other organizations and has some interesting perspectives on what it's taken for him to do that, and kind of underscores why I look for somebody else to do it for us. Nick, can you talk about what we do with IOCs internally here?
Yes, absolutely. So like with that, being a security practitioner with here at Red Canary, I mean, one of the things we do is, as much as Dave said, we leverage the Red Canary, the tool itself, but we also do our own searching tool on TTPs and other suspicious activities. And what we do is we leverage a SIEM like many other people, and we send all our event log data, everything else like most other companies, into our SIEM. And for us, we leverage Splunk in that area. And after the trick is we have basically the alerts in our SIEM that basically do correlation that detect TTPs as they come out, and if we want to look for historical type information that may have happened in the past. One of the challenges we faced while working and building this out was that, we wanted these as close to near time as possible. We wanted them as soon as they fired. The challenge we had is Splunk does have the ability to do real-time alerting capability. But what happens is it examines the alerts as they are being ingested in the Splunk. It's before they get added to the index. So as much as it can do that, it's processor intensive, and you also lose the ability to correlate events then. So we opted for the situation of let's not go real time. Let's run scheduled jobs maybe every 5 to 10 minutes, let the data get in the index, and then we can build more advanced correlated events where we can look at things of, hey, somebody logged in recently and ran maybe who am I, or within Azure and Cloud, something like get color identity with some other commands and correlate the events together, get something a little bit more value out of it. And we run them over like every 5 minutes over the last previous 5 minutes of data. And that's been very successful for us for searches for those TTPs or looking for ones that come up. I know recently there was one not that long ago where there was a Azure password spray, or I think it was a adversary in the middle type, and there's a specific string, user agent string, where we would then went through and looked to see have we ever seen this user agent string hit our environments before, and we still go through and leverage alerts in that way at Red Canary.
So thanks, Nick. And I one question, I guess, for anybody here, like, would be really interested, because I'd say like maybe, like philosophically, like the way IOCs are supposed to work is like you find a string, an IP, a domain name, and usually you find that the kind of hard way, right? Like you find a threat, and that's part of an investigation, and you don't want to find that the hard way in the future, right? You want to find that thing at that point, like you've got a bead on a good high quality indicator or adversary infrastructure, like you want that thing like short circuit to blocking or taking action. So I'm super curious how other folks do that. If anybody on, is interested in sharing in the chat, like what's your approach once you have an indicator that you have confidence in? Like, how do you fast track that so that you can respond to it or block it? I don't have any Splunk experience, and I know when like Nick was sharing this with me, I'm like, what do you mean you can't just like shim the system and put a list of these things up front and take them in the way in? And like that was an interesting understanding, particularly like how Splunk Cloud works is one example where it is like not cloud in the sense that it's SaaS, it's cloud in the sense that someone else is running the computer that runs Splunk for you. And so then it makes sense that you have those constraints. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm interested how other folks are doing that.
As we're waiting for those questions to come in the chat, Keith, you mentioned something there about, where do you find your IOCs? I've been on the receiving end of pitches for all kinds of security tooling. One of those sets of toolings is IOC sources. What has been Red Canary's experience with those and sort of perspective on those? Like if I'm thinking about buying one of those, what do I need to know about it? What do I need to do to operationalize that?
Yeah. And it's funny. I was just looking at the chat over here. Robert mentioned like blocking is a little bit more nuanced. And I think that's like there's a direct tie in there to the answer to your question, Dave. Like where does Red Canary source indicators and what do we do with them? I think for like a huge part of the nuance in like IOCs in general is that like a lot of times we'll just refer to them broadly, and um, like their pedigree to me is like the thing that matters the most. And that's been our experience over the years. Like we have, I remember the early days of Red Canary, like threat intel platforms were this big booming market, and you would pay someone tons of money and they would give you a list of domain names and like you were supposed to do something with them. And, but like, you don't have any context in terms of where those come from. And like that leads to like lengthy investigations. It also means you can't just take those and block them with confidence. And like, so for us, uh, like the indicators that matter the most, and I'd say the indicators that objectively have had the most value for us over the years are not surprisingly like they're the ones that we find, right? So like you run an investigation, and in the course of finding things probably the hard way by looking at behaviors, um, you find a couple indicators, and the job of the team and the platform is to then say like cherry pick those things as fast as possible moving forward. And so um, we have dabbled with things like indicator feeds over the years, and sometimes we will take indicators from like some a third party, but you got to have a high degree of like trust and understanding of where those came from if your intent is to put them in a position where they are fast tracked to action, if that makes sense, right? Like but the last thing you want, I think everyone has read enough times about some, company or some threat report putting 8888 as an IOC in their report, and then people taking that and feeding it to their infrastructure, and you've just blocked your upstream DNS provider, right? And like that's a bad time. So I think Scott just mentioned it here too, right? It depends on the IOC. And love the reference to pyramid of pain. It's funny. I think I actually had that in here. We were talking through this yesterday. It is um, those things, if you source them in the right way, they're exceptionally valuable and they can be surgically accurate. But there's a balance there, right? And again, it's like kind of like their pedigree or their provenance is like makes a ton of difference. So um, yeah, interesting discussion there. I'm just kind of looking through the.
So like from a philosophical perspective, if someone were looking to roll a SOC at home, would you recommend that they start with a threat intel or added a threat intel feed early on, or you find that it's been most effective to really develop the IOCs from your own detections of bad things coming out of your environment, like behavioral observations from an EDR sensor?
Um, yeah, I mean, I have, I have a little bit of an unfair advantage here, but I would say like the strongest recommendation, and like, well, we kind of like we put this out in the threat, like our threat detection report for a reason. Like when we talk about the top threats, but more like most importantly, from a detection standpoint, what we want to call attention to are the techniques or the behaviors that happen most often, right? Those are extremely durable. Attackers can change infrastructure whenever they want, IPs, domain names, file names, like those are all really kind of ephemeral and transactional. And so, um, like my number one recommendation to anyone, if you're going to go down the road of building a SOC, is like start by understanding the things adversaries have to do on your systems, like the behaviors. They are subject to the laws of physics, right? Like even with AI and all this other stuff that we're worried about, like adversaries can't change the way the target platform performs, right, or behaves. And so keying on those first and foremost for me is it. In doing that, you will find indicators, right? Like you will find static infrastructure and things like that. And then now you've kind of got your flywheel engaged. Um, that is like that to me is kind of the path to salvation in terms of a SOC. It's just like those behaviors will be far more durable over a long period of time. You will find indicators or IOCs along the way, but definitely like leading with those is probably gonna you'll end up with more questions than answers.
Hey, Chris Poro has a question here. It says, from what I understand, Red Canary automates a large part of the level one triage with AI/ML, correct? Does this automation also take actions blocking and feeding IOCs?
Uh, we do some level one triage. I'd say like early stage investigations using AI and ML. That's like largely for things like identity. It's pretty targeted. The automation side absolutely does take like blocking and like automation of those indicators into account. So like the way that works in the platform, very high level, just because I won't spend a ton of time on it, is like our job is to detect threats, call out those specific indicators, and then the automation function of the platform lets you do things like say, send all the IOCs of this type to this platform. And so like the common flow there is saying, send any network type indicators, domain names, IPs. Maybe you want to push those to Palo Alto so that you can automatically block those at your edge. And so that's kind of, it's the way that works from an operational standpoint here at Red Canary. All right. I love this discussion. We could do 2 more half hours on this very easily. I'm going to move us along. So we had another mailbag question. And I think this is like it's an easy segue, I think. And in particular, talking through like pyramid of pain and I like the IR like hierarchy of needs is also like near and dear here. I guess you'll see kind of some of those functions across the top. But the question was like, what should we be collecting? And so like, there's another kind of big, broad kind of opinion, like a strong opinion here in terms of like where you would start. But Dave, I'm going to kick it over to you first, right? And so it's like someone comes to you and says, "Hey, Dave, like I'm building a security program. I'm starting from scratch. If I can only pick like a couple few data sources, that's all I can afford to focus on. Like, what should they be?"
All right, so I'm gonna dodge the question just a little bit because the answer to that question depends on who's asking. In my role, there are typically three perspectives from which this question is asked. One of those perspectives is the one that's most near and dear to my heart, which is which one should we be collecting in order to protect the business most successfully? But the other two perspectives are you a customer that is requiring us to collect certain things as part of your security addendum, and because that's part of your third-party risk management, or are you an auditor that has a framework that says the framework expects you to collect these things? And in those other two perspectives, those requirements, while generally oriented towards a good outcome, may not necessarily be keeping up with the times as to what is most effective in collecting data. Right. And so the first question I always ask when faced with that is like, what is the expectation of the person asking? But for us, at least in the programs that I've run, endpoint is the place that I start, and for me, the highest fidelity endpoint telemetry is always going to be something EDR related, and then identity is the other source. Like you just have to have, because as identity detection, or sorry, as endpoint detection response has gotten more and more commoditized, as the industry as a whole has gotten better at identifying what bad behavior on an endpoint is, adversaries are moving, and that the bulk of the activity that we're seeing is over on the identity side.
Yeah, that's funny. Like those are the two that I would tend to pick. And incidentally, like please, this is another one of those areas where we'd kind of love opinions. Particularly, we would love to start a fight here. So if anyone has a strong opinion as to why Dave is wrong, this is your opportunity to speak up.
So I actually want to add one more thing on there, because early in my security journey, and I came into security after 23 years in product development. So I didn't start in network administration, didn't start in IT. I started over on the product side of the house. So AppSec is kind of my jam. But when I first started the program at my last job, I had a super talented guy on the team who told me that we would face an existential threat if we didn't budget $5 million for Splunk, because we needed to collect net flows. And besides the cost for storing and ingesting those net flows, we were running a lot of data centers, on-prem data centers, and our network equipment was running right at capacity. So even trying to tap them for net flows was going to knock the whole network over. And it took some intervention from some folks that have been doing SOC work at some really meaningful places. I got some advice from a guy that ran, I think, or worked in the SOC at Facebook and at Airbnb that said, net flows are great, but they're kind of taking you from 95% to 100%. Right? If you haven't got your EDR, your endpoint story on lock with something like EDR, you're missing the low-hanging fruit, and that's the part that's most affordable for most people. So, like that's one of the reasons I have since then pushed back on network detection response, and have only recently started to come around on that, because I do think there are parts of our networks that lack visibility without network detection response, things like IoT. Where you just don't have the ability to see without that.
No, that's awesome. That's a great perspective. And I think one thing I'll add here too, and I put this chart up on purpose because I also like, there's a dimension of this that I think doesn't get considered all that often. And, it's easy to look at this. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is kind of like, an adaptation of Sunil Yu's cyber defense matrix. It's a model that I love dearly and have used for like cybersecurity program building, but also I'd say Red Canary and kind of our roadmap and our journey through these different domains. is that you have to like, it's really important to understand like what your capacity is, right? And so like there's, identity and endpoint are kind of these two central pillars. And I would definitely agree with Dave. Like if you don't have those two things, you got a problem. Um, and I'd say like when and how you expand out from that is like not just a, consideration when it comes to like threat detection utility, but also your capacity to use that data to do like everything from identify all the way through respond and recover. Um, it's super, super easy to get into a situation like SIM is a great example where like you kind of funnel all this data in there and you're like, oh crap, like I don't have the capacity to go like write detection rules, run those investigative leads to ground so that I can respond to like the right things. So I don't know. It's always interesting to kind of plot that stuff and like, use this kind of model or something like it to say, hey, I believe strongly I'm going to start in these couple areas and then literally just kind of like draw arrows and just like chart your path through this based on like the utility of those things from a detective standpoint and an incident response standpoint, and also like you, frankly, like your team's capacity to do anything at all with that. Um, so yeah, very much appreciate it. And I keep an eye on time here. Like we're down to, we've got a few minutes left,
Yep.
Dave. I think you've had a little bit of time to look
Yep.
at the questions that are over there. We can, let's,
Yep.
let's go through, do lightning round. Would love to start taking some of the questions that folks, asked on the way in.
Yep. So there's a commonality across the questions. And for those, if we don't get to your question, they're going into the mailbag. We will get to them. We won't be able to get to all of them. But there's a common thread around, hey, what do we think about the government position and messaging around whether Russia is still an adversary in cyberspace and what we think is going on there?
Danger. All right. Well,
I can tell you what I'm thinking. Hey, I don't know. I'm not inside there. But as I parse carefully what's going on, when I read about Pete Hegseth's order for the military to stand down on adversarial actions and preparing for cyber action from Russia, it was very clear that that did not apply to the NSA. So what I'm hearing is that there is a portion of the government that is still tasked with this. So one possible explanation is that that is just a reduction of redundancy. I don't know whether that's wise or not. And I've also read some speculation that this might be a sort of throwing a bone to Putin to get him to come to the negotiating table around stopping the war in Ukraine. But I honestly don't know whether that's a good thing or not. It feels a little unnerving to send out messages that they're not an adversary because they certainly act like one.
I did not have geopolitics on my bingo card for this office hours, but perhaps I should have seen it coming. I will the thing I'll say, and like Dave, you alluded to this, is there's a tremendous amount of depth when you say something like U.S. government cybersecurity. Yes, there is the military and there are offensive military cyber operations and defensive. The same thing applies to domestic law enforcement. The same thing applies to like national intelligence, the NSA and the CIA. And so like, the headline having been intimately involved in kind of that area for a really long time is like, beware any headline that tries to oversimplify or generalize those things. There's just a tremendous amount of depth. So, all right, what else we got, Dave? What's next on the hopper there?
All right. Off the top of your head, Keith, do you know who APT-29 is? I don't keep track of the numbers.
No.
All right, we're gonna have to put that in the bag for later. We'll come back with a
Next.
perspective on that next time. With the rise of remote work, what unique security risks have you seen, and how can businesses mitigate those risks? Thank you, Jennifer, for that.
Ooh, cool. This is a fun one. So actually, I would say this is great. I think this is very, very directly adjacent to the conversation we are just having. I'll give you my perspective on it, looking at like what we've seen in the Red Canary, like security operations team over the years, particularly during COVID. The I'd say the very first thing that happened was that like a lot of organizations, particularly organizations that have been around for a long time, um, they lost a key choke point, which was the ability to see all traffic flowing through some sort of egress. A lot of folks still had like a hardware proxy solution. Not everyone had a proxy that was like and or a VPN that was captive and that everything flew through it. So that was probably like the biggest headline. And like the result of that was two things, I'd say, like big picture. Um, Identity became 10x more important, right? Like being able to use the IDP as the closest thing we had to a checkpoint when we kind of lost that blanket network visibility. And not just visibility, but also interdiction, right? Like not having all that traffic flow through that choke point didn't just cause detection problems, it caused blocking and response problems. Um, and I'd say there's an adjacency there, which was that, we kind of talk about network, which is like, I love to have this debate, which is like, should I start collecting network data? There's a really beautiful thing that happened when everyone really went all in on EDR, which is that we're actually getting what I would refer to as baby net flow from every endpoint on the network all the time. And so like that was another shift, meaning like we really started to rely heavily um, on network as a like contextual source for detection, but is a really useful source for investigative context, as you mentioned earlier, Dave, and being able to do like response based on network indicators. Um, and the beautiful thing was that like as EDR, like the big things that happened with remote work where identity became super important and like that really like the importance of EDR became more apparent because one of that big consequence of losing a choke point for traffic was that you still want a network visibility. And the good news is that you could still get it from somewhere, and that somewhere was EDR, right? It's imperfect compared to like a network tap or something, but it's still super valuable and not a thing you'd want to give up. So, what do we got, Dave? We got about 30 seconds left. Like anything else we want to hit?
Uh, I don't think we've got anything we can cover in 30 seconds.
All right, fair enough. Well, I tell you what. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we only got to a couple of questions. We are going to make good on our threat one way or the other to answer more of them. So, like, we've got them all captured, and maybe we'll take some at the end of next week's session. We'll kind of think through how to keep the momentum here. Really, really appreciate all of the time and feedback. We set up an email address. You can send us feedback directly, send us questions, topics, ideas. You can also feel free to email there and ask for gift cards. That's a common theme here in cybersecurity land. And as always, like your post-event, like that survey feedback that you all have been sending, wildly valuable and appreciated. So thank you all very much for coming and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.